The amount of intensity that it takes to produce the best results is remarkably little. People are shocked when I tell them, even for athletes that I've coached to the Olympics, to the podium at the Olympics, in the sport of cross-country skiing, which is a super high intensity sport, they maybe in their total training volume for the year do 10% of that training in what we might call zone 3 and 4. Hard training, high intensity training that leaves them, gasping with their hands on their knees at the end of the interval. 10%. And these are people that are doing races that, at the longest may last 30 to 40 minutes. So it's an incredibly high intensity event. And they don't need that much intensity. And when you start talking about people that are doing multi-hour events, then the amount of intensity that's needed even drops lower. It's like that haiku. You run a lot and some of it fast. So I think of this aerobic base as, instead of a sandcastle, you can think of it as like a cake. And then the intensity is the frosting on the top. That's all it is. It's just a little bit of frosting on the top that makes it just a little bit sweeter or allows you to run just a little bit faster. But it ain't the cake. I mean, with the frosting without the cake is not really going to be anything.
Welcome back to the Mops and Mo's podcast with Alex and Drew. We've talked a lot about Zone 2 cardio, and this is the episode where we're going to really dig into that topic specifically. Drew, what do we got?
So our guest today, Scott Johnston is his name. He is an OG rock climber, alpinist, skier. He got his start in the 60s and 70s in Boulder, Colorado. And from there got into Olympic level skiing, swimming. But what he is most known for folks in the sort of tactical training community, folks that are familiar with the alpinism world, are two of his books, Training for the New Alpinism and Training for the Uphill Athlete. He, alongside one of the probably world's greatest climbers in his day, Steve House, put pen to paper and really were the first ones to go after this idea of Zone 2 training, which I think in the tactical space is incredibly important because for so long, as everybody knows, it's been a lot of push-ups, pull-ups, run as fast as you can, now transitioning to sort of lift as hard as you can. And what we wanted to bring Scott on to talk about was legitimately, and no pun intended, slowing things down, building up volume. How do you construct an appropriate aerobic base? What does that plan look like? So we do get into the weeds a little bit intentionally because we want to kind of tease out some practical training tips. But you'll hear him mention this at the end. We'll mention it here at the beginning. If this does strike a chord and if you are interested in learning more about this type of thing, which I think we both highly encourage, we would direct you towards Uphill Athlete, the site, a ton of blog entries on how to construct training, what it means to build an aerobic base, the physiology behind it. So it's a good one.
A lot of coaches do not always appreciate the aerobic conditioning side of things. We're trying to give light to that a little bit because you might have noticed in previous content, Drew and I are both of the opinion that aerobic cardiovascular conditioning is a little bit underrated in the tactical strength and conditioning space as it stands right now.
Enjoy. How did you, I don't think I've ever asked you this, but how did you come about sort of your arrival into the importance of Zone 2 and the importance of aerobic base building? Because I know your background was in competition, but were you playing around with that back then, or did you just sort of arrive at that coaching the likes of Steve and the athletes?
No, but it was accidental, I have to say. I mean, I didn't come at it, from, let's say, a scientific standpoint or an educational standpoint where somebody explained all this to me. But having been, an endurance athlete since childhood and having had, in a couple of cases, really outstanding coaches, I'd been exposed to this and I'd actually used it in my own training without knowing what I was doing. I just did what the coach said to do. And I was a dumb kid and didn't think about why I was doing it. And it was only later when when I was an adult and I was thrust into a position where I was told, I was asked to be, and I accepted an offer to become a coach to a junior cross country ski program in the place I live. And I thought, oh my God, I don't know anything about this. I mean, I knew I had been a skier myself, on the World Cup and had competed, and I knew what to do, sort of. But it was only then when I realized I'm pretty incompetent. I mean, I don't know why I would tell these kids to do what I'm telling them to do. And I just began to kind of devour all this information that I could find, some on the internet, some in books, that sort of thing. And I began to seek out like some of the best coaches that had heard about, and especially in the sport of running, because there's so much published information there. And as I read and I began to understand the physiology, I went, oh, that's why my coach in high school was having us do blah, blah, blah. All this base training, all these, in a pool, all these meters in a pool that we were doing as swimmers. We were swimming 20,000 meters a day for, 5 or 6 days a week. That's a lot of time in a pool, 5 hours a day, basically. And I didn't, when you're swimming that much or that far, you can't swim very fast. So you're by virtue of the volume of training, the bulk of it ends up being in that lower intensity aerobic zone. And I went on to, to excel in swimming. It was later when I got bored with swimming and got introduced to skiing that I switched to cross country skiing. But it was only later, honestly, that, I went, oh, there's a reason we were doing 20,000 meters a day, or there's a reason that the best marathoners in the world run 100 plus miles a week. And then it was started like, oh, that makes sense. And then I began to read, old time coaches that were, even well before my day, which is now getting kind of a long time ago, saying the same stuff. And I thought, there's a history of this. These coaches, even though these coaches, they might have not known, a mitochondria from, their next door neighbor, but they knew that if you did all this high volume of this low intensity training, it would improve the athlete's performance. And so there's a long history now of this stuff, and it's only, but I think now with the internet and and I think the rise in the popularity of, well, maybe we should go there later, but that's kind of my origin story a little bit of how I came to understand this.
Well, it's funny you mentioned the internet piece of it, and I think we've seen this across, and I think you and I have probably talked about this too, across human performance and training in general. It becomes, the prevalence of information overcomplicates things, so much so that when you do get to the point where you are prescribing aerobic base work, at least from what I've experienced with athletes, the simplicity of it can kind of throw people off sometimes, because they expect things to be way more complex than just, like you said, meters in the pool or miles on the road. And it's just interesting to think back to all those coaches and all those years of just doing basic aerobic base work.
Well, you remember, I'm sure you've watched some old Hollywood movie, or Sylvester Stallone, and where they did boxers did road work. They ran 10 miles a day. And so even then, in a combat sport with 3-minute bouts, they understood the importance of this, even without probably understanding why. They knew that these boxers needed to do this road work. Same thing you could say, with many sports, that there's been this sort of, I'm a big believer that the coaches lead the way when it comes to discovering the best training methodologies. And it's only later that the scientists come in and explain, oh, that happens because of this, cascade of events that result in these genes being expressed, and blah, blah, blah happens. And it's wonderful knowledge to have. And I think it has really helped sports science. But the coaches are going, yeah, we've been doing that for 30, 40 years. So what's the big deal? And I think that you're right, Drew, about the simplicity of it. I once was listening to a talk by quite a famous exercise scientist and coach, Michael Joyner, and he's also an MD. And at the end of the talk, when somebody asked him, so wow, you have all this, he's a running coach, you have all this amazing information. Like, why don't you write a book about training for running? And he said, because it can be summarized as a haiku. Run a lot, some of it fast. I mean, that's not very complicated, then I think that so that gets to your point, Drew, about, this isn't that hard to do. And you're right, people are looking for something more complex. And certainly you guys know this well from your world. I mean, it is complicated to train for higher intensity or strength and conditioning. There are a lot of factors that need to be balanced. Whereas what we're telling these people is, yeah, you need to go out the door and run for an hour and be able to either breathe through your nose or have a conversation while you're doing it. And that's really about it. That's the simplicity.
One of the twists I find too, Drew talked about the prevalence of information available on the internet. And I think a dark side of that, and you alluded to it, is that people are looking for certain things, and some people are just going to give them what they're looking for, regardless of whether it's what they need or what's useful or what's correct. And so there's a huge portion of the internet that's dedicated to providing whatever information is going to get the most clicks rather than what's going to get the best results.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And I think that's, it used to be that this information, we had to dig it out of books or, medical, or not medical, research journals and things like that. And so it ended up only being pretty credible sources that were publishing this information. And so if you read it, you would have, have a pretty good reason to believe, the person's credentials or the information. And yes, you're right. I think there's so much crappy information out there now that it's a little harder to filter through. And I think you're absolutely right, Alex, that there's, and I won't name names here, but I think there are some fads in fitness that have become popular in the last 15, 20 years that are incredibly good business plans, but terrible plans for, especially if you're an athlete. I mean, if you're just wanting to be active, then some of those kind of fitness fads, they're certainly a lot better than sitting on a couch. But if you actually have performance goals that as an athlete, and in our case, in your case, tactical athletes that need to meet certain performance goals, especially if it's for some sort of selection. And Drew knows that that's kind of the area that I've been drawn into. I deal quite often with military athletes that are aiming for like a tier 1 selection. And so they've got a very specific athletic goal, which is quite different than somebody who just wants to be active and hopefully, again, move. Just moving is what most people need. But we're talking about a different population when we talk about athletes that have goals. And I think those two things can become confused.
Mm-hmm. Can you, because what I want to try to put across by having this conversation with you is the basic building blocks of endurance training. I think Alex and I both have seen this across with tactical, well, really strength and conditioning in general, but specifically the tactical community. There's a really deep understanding of the resistance training side of things, but a real shallow understanding of the endurance side of things. So I want to kind of walk through sort of the heart rate zone methodology, especially the zone 2 piece, what that really means, how you might go about finding some of that, and then getting into some of the practical nuggets of like, if somebody is new to running, or if somebody is looking to kind of restructure their endurance stuff because maybe they've hit a wall or maybe they're beat up, like what that might look like. Because that's when I talk about endurance training, as simple as we try to make it, some folks I think just kind of miss the mark because it's almost too, it's so simple that it becomes confusing, if that makes sense. Can you explain the zoning strategy that specifically, I suppose, the one that we use at Uphill Athlete?
Sure. It's based on the concept that training for endurance is what you're trying to do is affect your metabolism. So there's your metabolism, and I would like to briefly dive into what metabolism is, because until people understand that, I think it's hard to grasp that overall overarching concept. But you're trying to change your body's metabolism. And whereas training for strength is primarily like a neurologic training effect, you're trying to induce or to force nerves to either fire more powerful motor units, or to recruit more of them with the central nervous system to recruit more of those motor units. So it's primarily a nervous system training thing. And so you have these two, endurance trains metabolism, strength trains the nervous system primarily. Then there's obviously crossover, but and I think some people have tried to, again, bring strength training ideas into the endurance training world, but they're totally different. You're trying to affect different changes, so you need to appreciate that. So let me see if I can briefly describe metabolism. So the energy to contract a muscle is created through a process that's known as metabolism. And what happens in that metabolism process is a little molecule called adenosine triphosphate, that people know as ATP, is created. And that ATP is essentially, we can think of it as like the gasoline that fuels that muscle contraction. Now, how that ATP is generated is the interesting part of metabolism. We have two pathways metabolically to produce this ATP. One of them essentially breaks down fats and uses oxygen to create ATP, whereas the other one breaks down sugars in the form of glycogen, which is two glucose molecules stuck together, but that's how we store sugar, is in glycogen. It breaks down glycogen to produce ATP, but does not use oxygen. So the pathway that you can have aerobic glycolysis, or you can break down glycogen aerobically, because the aerobic pathway can use either fat or sugars or carbohydrates, whereas the what we call the anaerobic pathway, that does not use any oxygen, only breaks down carbohydrates or sugars. And what we want to induce through, when I said we wanted to change our metabolism, what we're trying to do is increase the production rate of ATP in the muscle cells, so that we can have more muscle contractions, more powerful muscle contractions for a longer time. And that's essentially what endurance is. And through proper endurance training methods, we can cause those changes in the muscle cells themselves that will allow you to run farther, faster. So that's kind of the quick 2-minute discussion of how this works at the muscle cell level. Now, if we run too fast, if we run so fast that we need more ATP than that aerobic pathway can supply, because the aerobic pathway is somewhat limited speed-wise in its ability to produce ATP, then the body will rely very heavily on that anaerobic pathway. So when you sprint as hard as you can for 200 meters, the energy that's coming from that is predominantly produced by the anaerobic pathway, because it can produce ATP very quickly. Unfortunately, when it does so, there's a number of metabolites that come out of that metabolic process that will cause you to slow down. Anybody who's ever tried to sprint for 200 meters knows exactly what I'm talking about. That by 230 meters, your legs are about to fall off. You're going to be forced to slow down, because you can't maintain this pace. And it's not because you're weak, it's not because you lack endurance, it's because you're using this pathway that produces these we won't call them waste products, because they're not waste products, but they are a byproduct that actually will force you to come to a stop. And you can test this out on yourself. Go run up a hill as hard as you can for as long as you can, and you will eventually come to a stop, because that pathway gets shut down. Now, endurance that you obviously need for anything over about 2 minutes is predominantly fueled by the aerobic pathway. So even running a mile is predominantly fueled by the aerobic pathway. And so in order to enhance the aerobic pathway's ability to produce energy, we need to train in and at an intensity that stimulates predominantly that aerobic metabolic path. If we train too hard, then we're going to be overly reliant on that other anaerobic pathway, which is a useful pathway, and we don't want to completely neglect it, but it's not the essential one that we need. And especially for people that are involved in multi-day or even, and especially multi-hour and especially multi-day, let's say going through one of these selections events, when you need to be able to keep moving for hour after hour, that's the aerobic pathway that's providing that energy. And so it turns out that the best way to improve this aerobic pathway's ability to produce ATP is to train at an intensity that's somewhat below that pathway's maximum production level. And we call that the aerobic threshold. It could also be called the maximum aerobic function, but it's something that can be fairly easily determined in a number of different tests. But there's also some really simple ways you ask about, Drew, to determine, what is that? What's that intensity look like, and what's it feel like? And it probably feels a lot easier than most people are even willing to admit and to understand. But if you don't have access to any sort of testing facility where you can determine it, and you don't use some of the methods that we prescribe with an uphill athlete, that's fine. You don't need them. If you can run, we're using running because I think it's kind of the universal aerobic based training, and people in your world need to be able to run. But if you can run and carry on, speak in full sentences, and kind of right at the limit of being able to carry on a conversation with your running partner, then you are in that aerobic realm metabolically, and you are enhancing that metabolic pathway's ability to produce ATP. Another test would be, can you breathe through your nose and do this? Kind of the very upper limit of nose breathing will also be probably the top of that aerobic zone. And now the hard part to sell this to most people is, if people have not been training this way, they don't have a long history of endurance training, or they haven't been training like this in months, they are going to be so shocked at how little ATP that aerobic system can produce that they may even have to walk to stay in this intensity zone. And that's hard on the ego. And it's also hard for people who are used to high intensity and harder training. They will go, wait a minute, this can't be doing anything. I don't feel like I'm even working.
So I'm going to go back to just, running as hard as I can. If I've got 30 minutes to run, I'm going to go out the door and run as hard as I can for 30 minutes. If I've got an hour, I'll run as hard as I can for an hour. But unfortunately, what that does is it actually downregulates that aerobic pathway and upregulates this anaerobic pathway that is not really as useful. So something an example I will give people to help them kind of wrap their heads around how incredible, how much energy can be produced by the aerobic system, is to explain that the road marathon is an event that is competed at the top of this aerobic zone that we're talking about. And it doesn't matter if you are a 4-hour marathoner or if you are a 2-hour marathoner like Eliud Kipchoge. Both those people are in the same metabolic state. One of them is running, 9.5 minute miles, and the other one's running 4.5 minute miles. But they're both maximally using their own personal aerobic capacity to do this. Now, it's hard for most of us. Most of us could not run 200 meters at the pace that Eliud Kipchoge can run 26 miles. But I think it's illustrative to understand that he got there. Obviously, I'm sure he has some special genetic gifts, but he got there just through years and years of training this aerobic capacity so that it could produce more of this special molecule, ATP, that allows him to run faster. And over the years with the people I've worked with, I will frequently get emails from people who, oh my God, I didn't believe this would work. And when I started, I had to run 13.5-minute miles. And now at the same effort, the same breathing, same heart rate, now I'm running 7.5-minute miles. I mean, just by building this aerobic base. And they haven't even done any intensity. So remember what I said that Michael Joyner had said, is that you run a lot and some of it fast. The some of it fast is important, but it's a supplement to and not a replacement for this aerobic base training that we're talking about. And I think that's what people think sometimes, is that high intensity training is somehow a shortcut to fitness, aerobic fitness. And that's one of those things, Alex, you were talking about, that the sort of the snake oil salesmen on the internet have kind of been able to convince people is, oh yeah, you can run your best marathon on 3 20-minute HIIT workouts a week. Well, if that could happen, then people like Eliud Kipchoge would be doing it, and they're doing the exact opposite.
I think it's important, like, because I've noticed this specifically training guys that, like you mentioned, have this big deficit. In my opinion, the biggest barrier to entry, if you want to call it that, for proper aerobic training is the fact that if you are very new to this, and I will include myself because I was in this position, you will be walking for part of that. A lot of it will be whenever you encounter hills. Sometimes you'll be walking uphill. And I think, because I've seen this happen where you will prescribe, 30 minutes, 40 minutes of a run at a particular heart rate, and they'll come back and say, I went way higher than I was supposed to, but I kept running the whole time, and they'll think that it was a win. And you have to reiterate to them that no, the goal is to stay below that threshold, because we're looking at changing physiology. We're not looking at changing performance just yet. And if they can get around that idea of there might be walking involved, you might be moving much slower than you think, and there's some patience behind it, then like you said, like, you reap the rewards after a couple of weeks, and you're off to the races. No pun intended. That was a pretty bad pun.
Well, I think a piece of this too, and I think this is how we like connect it to the tactical space a little bit, is that when you look at traditional endurance sports, you're probably looking at like a prototypical type of person without a lot of variability. You're looking at like really skinny, smaller people who like excel in those domains. And now we're trying to apply that kind of training methodology to a person who's much bigger, and therefore to move at the same pace, their heart and lungs are going to have to do a lot more work. And that changes what the experience feels like and what the starting point is.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's much harder when you're carrying around all that extra weight. I mean, it's extra for the runner, but not extra for the tactical athlete. Then yes, those muscles, those big biceps, those big deltoids, they need oxygen when you're running. And if they need a lot of oxygen, I mean, they're not working, but they have to be fed oxygen too, or they will die. And so part of that, your limited blood supply, instead of being able to go to your legs to help propel you, is having to go to those big, deltoids or trapezius muscles that aren't helping you run at all. So yeah, big, heavily muscled people struggle more. But I've again worked with some of these fellows who are pretty conventional, tactical, military athletes, who are going through these selections that last weeks that involve being on their feet for all day long, essentially moving continuously, and they get there. They may not be running 4.5-minute miles at their aerobic threshold, but they're running 7-minute miles at their aerobic threshold, and they started in this 12-minute mile pace. So yes, you're right. A lot of big guys don't like to run because the impact loading is significant. And one of the things I think we should touch on, since we're really talking almost exclusively about using running for this type of training, and I think it's a good tool. Running's a great tool for improving your aerobic capacity, because for most of the events that we're talking about training guys for, they are footborne activities. They are, you're either rucking or you're running, and you can't improve your running or your rucking on a rowing machine. it doesn't, they don't translate, because rowing machine is not weight bearing. Bicycles are not weight bearing activities. And so they use, you're not having to support your whole body weight against gravity. And so they're different. They're better than nothing, for sure. If you've got somebody who has an injury, obviously they're going to need to get off of the weight bearing modality and get into something that's like cycling. But back to the running part, one of the challenges I've learned over many years is people who do not have this running background, and especially if they're on the big side, heavily muscled, you have to be really careful and very gradual in introducing high volume of running to them. The reason being, and this is something that I think is talked about a lot, I don't see it much even in the running space, is that the connective tissues, the fascia and the tendons especially, and especially in the lower legs, they are very poorly vascularized. So they adapt to training loads very slowly. And your muscles, on the other hand, will adapt to the training quite quickly, because the muscles are incredibly well vascularized. And the consequence of that is you may begin to feel fitter, but all those connective tissues that are holding your joints together aren't yet very strong. And so people, within a few weeks, they start to feel faster and fitter. They want to run faster. And then they do. And a week later, they've got Achilles tendonitis or plantar fasciitis, very common running injuries. And so what I am prone to do when I'm working with people who don't have a strong running background is we'll start with, maybe they're going to be running 8 miles, 10 miles a week maximum. Maybe they do 3 running sessions a week, and we see how they can handle. If they can handle 8 or 10 miles a week, and then I always do that in 2-week blocks. So if they were doing 10 miles, they would do 10 miles a week for 2 weeks. And then we could, because during that 2 weeks, if something's going to pop up, it'll probably show its head pop up somewhere in the middle or to the end of that second week. And we could go, oh, okay, this is all you're capable of handling right now. And then I might bump it up by 10 to 20% in the early days. But once we get up around 20 miles per week, then I will only increase mileage by no more than about 10% per week, or per 10%, excuse me, for these 2-week blocks. And what I found with that is, even with the military athletes I've worked with, I've not had any ever get, the traditional lower leg running injuries that have caused them to have to stop training. And so I think that's another caveat for people that are going to dive into endurance training and want to do it with running, is be very gradual. And if you are, if you're 2 miles from home and you're all of a sudden that Achilles flares up, don't keep running. Stop, call somebody, hitchhike a ride, something home. Do not try to run through these injuries. That's the fastest way to end your whole running progression, is to, to say, oh, I think I can make it back to base, or no, I'm tough. I can deal with this. No, you're not. You're not that tough. I promise you. It will cripple you in a matter of, a few miles even. So be very cautious of this. And in the end, it will pay enormous dividends. Like Drew said, you will see dramatic changes.
One of the things that brings to mind something that actually I learned from Uphill Athlete years and years ago when I started using it was using, and this is getting into the weeds, but using minutes as a prescription versus distance. And Scott, this is something I think you and I talked about a long time ago, because what I noticed with a lot of tactical guys is that if you prescribe a distance, say 3 miles, 4 miles, no matter what you include in terms of intensity prescriptions, or, hey, I want you to run at this pace, what they'll see is, I'm going to complete this distance as fast as I can. And I think you sort of touched on it. If you're X many miles away from base or wherever it is that you're heading, generally speaking, whether you realize it or not, you're going to speed up to finish that distance. Whereas if you prescribe a time-based session, like 30 minutes, 45 minutes of zone 2 training, at least from what I've seen, folks are much more inclined to complete that the right way, because no matter how fast or slow you run, it's going to take you 30 minutes, 45 minutes. So you're better off sticking to the goal of the session, which is that base building piece, than just going as hard as you can, because inevitably you're going to slow down anyway within that time frame.
You're absolutely right. I misspoke. I should have. I was using miles because I think in running terms, and runners talk about miles. But you're absolutely right. But you can use the same metric in terms of progressing it. In terms of 10 or 20%. Same. It's the same idea. But I believe you're right in terms of trying to create this notion that you're going to go run for 30 minutes at this effort level.
Mhm.
And some people might run 3.5 miles, and some people might run 2.5 miles in that 30 minutes, and it doesn't matter because they both got, this is the interesting part, they both got the same training stimulus.
Mhm.
One of them is already perhaps a little better aerobically adapted and allowed them to run a longer distance in that 30 minutes, but they both got the same training stimulus, and that's what we're looking for is what's the optimal training stimulus.
Well, and I see this with coaches too, where if we go, and not, I mean, I don't want to go down a rabbit hole necessarily, but if we go off of a distance prescription, you end up having to do a lot of funky math if you're dealing with a group of people, because you have to figure out, okay, you're going to go to this cone, this other person's going to go to that cone because I need them to all finish at kind of the same place. And it becomes this weird calculus problem. Whereas if you just have, it can be 5 people, it can be 500 people. You're all going to run for 30 minutes. You're all going to go at a pace that allows you to breathe through your nose. I mean, for lack of a better prescription, that's a pretty good way to handle group training for endurance.
Yeah, it is. It gets them all back to the starting line at the same time. So if you're needing to function as a group, then yes, it will get them. Some of them are going to have to turn around. They're all going to turn around at 15 minutes and head back. And some of them are just going to be turning around at a lesser distance out there. But yes, that does, I think, work pretty well. Having coached athletes where you send them out to train and you're waiting with the van in the parking lot for half an hour because there's somebody straggling in, that's not very much fun. So I think for groups, this is a really good way, and this is an area where you guys know a lot more about that than I do. I tend to work with individual athletes.
Yeah.
There are a couple of things I'm hoping to tease out as we go, and I think they'll hopefully help tie it to why we think some of this uphill athlete alpinism stuff ties really well to the tactical stuff. But I know like uphill found some significant success recently, and not that recent, like over the last few years with best ranger competition competitors. And I'd just love to hear a little bit about that in terms of like why we think that population was drawn to this programming and what they were looking for, and why you think they found so much success doing it.
Well, I think that they were drawn to it, and I had no influence in this. I didn't find out that it was being used. I did know it was being used in particular by some of the, especially the unit that was using some of our training methods, or some of the guys who were getting into the selection for the unit were using some of the uphill athlete training methods. But it was only lately that I discovered that people training for the best ranger competition were also using these methods. It makes complete sense to me, because that's an event that lasts, what is it? I think roughly 60 to 65 hours, somewhere in that range of continuous movement. And obviously you have these tactical events scattered throughout it, but you're having to move between those tactical events, some of the time running, but much of the time rucking. And when you arrive at that tactical event, you need to be able to complete it effectively, because you're scored on each individual event. And so when you get to the obstacle course or the firing range or whatever, you need to be able to perform at a very high level. Now, the beauty and the importance of this aerobic base, and this is where the alpinism part comes in, and maybe I should make a little bit of a comparison, but let's keep with the rangers for a minute. By using energy that's produced by this aerobic metabolic pathway, you're not having to dip into your relatively limited reserves of stored carbohydrates in the form of glycogen, which you need for that obstacle course that you're going to have to complete in the next 2 minutes. That's a high intensity event that needs this carbohydrate fuel. But if you've been burning away that carbohydrate fuel in this glycogen just to ruck between events, then when you get to the obstacle course, that fuel tank is empty or very much drained down. And so your performance on the obstacle course is likely to be much worse because you don't have access to some of those faster twitch muscle fibers that rely on glycogen. And so what we found, and this was something I found through alpinism years and years ago with my own climbing, but then I began to coach some high level alpinists. And so the definition of alpinism, for those that don't know, it's basically like really dangerous, hard climbing on the hardest routes on the biggest mountains. It's not hiking up to the top of Mount McKinley, Denali, or Mount Everest, with following a fixed rope and with Sherpas carrying your loads. That's not alpinism. Alpinism is going and finding the biggest, nastiest, hardest thing that can be climbed and tackling it. So that is often results in somebody having to be on a climb, moving continuously for many, many hours, at least, 6, 7, 8 hours, and sometimes 30 to 50, 60 hours of continuous movement with some extremely high intensity sections and periods built into it. So very much like the Ranger competition. So your body doesn't know, your muscles don't know what they're doing. They just know they're contracting. So the training methodologies that we've developed for training these alpinists are perfectly applicable to this military tactical world, because the muscle just is doing this. It's just contracting. So this 65-hour best Ranger competition could, from a muscle standpoint, it wouldn't know the difference if it was, on the Eiger North Face. Doesn't care. And so what was discovered and brought to my attention by, in this particular case, the winner of the 2001 Best Ranger competition, Vince Pikowski, he came to me and said, "Hey, I won this competition that year, and I wanted to let you know that I used the training methodologies that you prescribe in the book and Training for the New Alpinism and on the website." And he said, and the interesting part, Vince is a really curious guy. And one of the things he did that I found very fascinating. I mean, I wasn't surprised that he could use those methodologies and win. He and his partner, I should say, not just him. But what I found really fascinating was at the end, he did an analysis of the finishing teams. As you know, I can't remember how many teams start, but not all that many teams, maybe 20 teams get to finish. They get paired out as they go along. And he did an analysis of all the finishing teams. And what he discovered was the teams that had the least degradation, the teams that had the fastest running and rucking times between events had the least degradation in their shooting skills over the course of the event. So they got higher scores on the target range. And as a consequence, their overall score ended up being higher. And again, that wasn't surprising to me because, again, that's like alpinism. I mean, you have to have enough endurance to get from one really hard spot on the mountain to another really hard spot on the mountain, and then be able to perform at an extremely high level. So very similar to whether it's an obstacle course or the shooting range. And he was in, I think he understood the implication of that is because these guys these winning teams, best performing teams, could run and ruck in that aerobic zone, using that aerobic energy system predominantly, they were able to perform better when it came time to, really do something that was super demanding. And I think that was the takeaway. And then this year, I think you guys know, he worked with a number of different teams. And he was coaching some of the teams personally, and then he had provided training plans to a few of the other teams that wanted to prepare, and it was based on this exact same methodology that he used. And this year, the teams using that same methodology went first, second, third, fourth, 6th and 7th. So out of the top, that's 6 out of the top 10 teams that were using this type of aerobic based training methodology. So I think it's proven itself in conventional sports. I've used it now for years, working with the athletes, some of these military guys heading for these tier 1 selections. And now we're seeing it, at the best ranger level, producing, the best results. So I think we can say with some confidence that it actually does work. It's this is not theoretical anymore, and yes, it's nice to understand the theory about these energy production pathways, but in the end, what you really want to know is, am I going to be better at my job? Am I going to be faster? Am I going to perform better at in this case, combat type of situations? So this is obviously simulated kind of combat situation, but nonetheless, the idea behind that best ranger competition is to test all of these qualities that they think are the most important qualities to have for the combat soldier.
Mm-hmm. Can you talk, because I know the base building piece, and once an athlete has kind of gone through their paces, so to speak, with accumulating what you as the coach would consider enough aerobic volume, can you talk about how you start to introduce intensity the correct way, as opposed to just, hey, I've done 5-6 weeks of running, now it's time to go and hit it hard?
Yeah, well, obviously 5 or 6 weeks would be on the short side of the
Right,
end of that.
exactly.
And one of the things I think that's important to keep in mind, so I mentioned this guy Eliud Kipchoge that can run a 2-hour marathon. I have seen athletes improve their running pace at this aerobic threshold for 10 years consistently over the course. Every year they get faster and faster and faster. So it obviously an elite athlete like him, he's continued to improve that year after year for decades probably now. And so I think people should understand this is not something that you are going to maximize in one 4-month training cycle. You can keep building it forever. But at some point you are going to need to introduce some high intensity training. And that's because probably the event you're training for will involve some kind of intensity somewhere in it. And so to your point, Drew, yeah, maybe this guy's only got 8 weeks before whatever this event that he needs to. Maybe it's a selection process where he has to do the Army physical fitness test or something like that. And so at some point he better start adding a little bit of intensity so that perhaps his mile time we can improve it a little bit. The way I like to introduce intensity in terms of the running intensity, let's say I'm trying to work with somebody who's headed for wants to improve their 3-mile running time. We do a lot of this aerobic based training, but at some point we start doing things like mile repeats. I almost never go shorter than a mile. And we'll do mile repeats at a pace that I feel is appropriately hard for them. I usually have them do a 3-mile time trial so I can see what they're how fast or how hard they can how fast they can run 3 miles. And then I will set their mile repeats based on that, usually taking that time. So let's say they ran an average of 8-minute miles. Initially, I would have them start at running 8:20s, 3 times 8:20s with a 5-minute rest in between them. But when I'm adding this intensity, I do not reduce the aerobic base training. And I think that is where this can become confusing for folks, is they think, like you said, Drew, okay, I've done all that stupid aerobic base training stuff. Now I'm going to get into the real business here. But you have to remember that aerobic base training is the support. It's the metabolic support for this high intensity training. And if you stop doing it or you decrease the training load of that, you're going to be able to handle the high intensity. You're going to do worse at the high intensity training, frankly. And so what I try to tell them is, we're going to add as much intensity as we can until you are so fatigued from it, we have to reduce your base training by more than about 10%. If we have to reduce the aerobic base volume by more than 10%, then you're not capable of handling any more intensity, frankly, at this point. And this is running intensity I'm talking about. Now, there's other ways to do intensity training. And one of the ways that, obviously for many of these guys, it's going to be, fast rucking. And so that is, that can factor in as well. But I don't generally use a high volume of fast rucking because of the injury potential with it. It's so high. And I've got guys who are literally heading for these tier 1 selections, and if they get injured, they're out. They're not even going to make it to the selection. So I have to be very careful with that. But I've still found that if they run well, they're going to do fine in the ruck. They obviously have to carry a pack at some point in their training, but it's usually not. I don't have them running with a ruck except on very rare occasions.
Mm-hmm.
I will ask you. You started talking about adding an intensity the right way, which reminded me of something Drew keyed me into within the last couple of days that I was hoping to pull out here. But the sandcastle metaphor of adding intensity was a pretty cool one to me. So I was hoping you could explain that for the audience here.
Yeah, so we can think of, let me try I didn't write that article on the website, but I think it's a very clever analogy. So let me see if I can recreate it here. But basically, the sandcastle is a combination of the sand and some water. And, with too much, basically the intensity being, and I think it's in this case, I got this right, the water, you add too much water and the sandcastle begins to fall apart. And the idea is there's got to be this careful mix. And if you think about the amount of water that's in a sandcastle and compare that to the intensity that's in one of these training plans, it's not very much. The amount of intensity that it takes to produce the best results is remarkably little. People are shocked when I tell them, even for athletes that I've coached to the Olympics, to the podium at the Olympics in the sport of cross-country skiing, which is a super high intensity sport, they maybe in their total training volume for the year do 10% of that training in what we might call zone 3 and 4, hard training, high intensity training that leaves them, gasping with their hands on their knees at the end of the interval. 10%. And these are people that are doing races that, at the longest may last 30 to 40 minutes. So it's an incredibly high intensity event. And they don't need that much intensity. And when you start talking about people that are doing multi-hour events, then the amount of intensity that's needed even drops lower. It's like that haiku. You run a lot and some of it fast. So I think of this aerobic base as, instead of a sandcastle, you can think of it as like a cake. And then the intensity is the frosting on the top. That's all it is. It's just a little bit of frosting on the top that makes it just a little bit sweeter or allows you to run just a little bit faster. But it ain't the cake. I mean, with the frosting without the cake is not really going to be anything.
I think speaking of references online, and I pulled it up because I'm going to butcher this guy's name, but Scott, you'll immediately recognize this. The speed skater, Nils van der Poel, I believe.
Nils van der Poel, yeah.
So for people that are unaware, he won, and correct me on the event, he won gold on it. Was it a 10K?
He won the 10,000 meters this
10,000 meter, and then decided to put his entire training program online for free, as well as his essentially a free ebook of his training plan. And I think we immediately, in the uphill athlete community, we immediately shared it, because if you look at some of the foundational base building sessions that this guy's doing, it is insanity. One, the duration of it, multi-day, 6-hour, 8-hour bike rides, but at wattages that if you go and try to hit those on a bike, to the point earlier about Eliud Kipchoge and his pace, just asinine how the capability that this guy has. So talking about articles that you should look at online, that is one that I would drive people towards if you want to just get sort of an idea of what it really means when we sit here and talk about, you can do this for forever and see improvement for forever.
I've plugged that article on Mops and Mo's before, and I'll certainly plug it again because I think it's been a couple months since I shared it, but it's good insight, and he provides a lot of the same philosophy we're talking about here.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously an extreme. He took it to an extreme, which is really interesting. But the interesting part, I mean, he'd been extremely successful as a speed skater already, and here he comes into the Olympics and decides to say, "I'm going to try, this extreme level of aerobic base training," where he was training 20 to 30 hours a week. I think mostly 30 hours a week, largely on a bike, although during the process he did do a 100-mile running race. And as you said, Drew, the wattages that this guy was able to produce on his average watts on like a 5 or 6 hour ride were the kind of watts you would see, from a Tour de France rider in a race.
Yeah.
I mean, the guy could have a career as a professional bicycle rider, bicycle racer now. I was impressed. I was very impressed by it. But when I read it, I read it in the Wall Street Journal. The article was written during the reporter reported during the Olympics, and I read it and I quickly clicked on this thing that he had published, which was kind of his manifesto on training. And I read it and it was like, whoa, what a kindred spirit this guy is. I mean, he gets it, he understood it. And I've since seen there's a very interesting interview with him and his coach with Steven Seiler, who's quite a famous exercise physiologist. They go into some of the details, but yes, I don't think most people would either have the time or the willingness to train 30 hours a week. But you can see that, as you said, this stuff works.
Yeah. And I think I use it almost as a marketing pitch for folks that have a tough time, like we said, digesting this idea that in the early days, it may be a lot slower than you think, but all you really need to do is look at examples like that. Or you can look at the video. There's been a couple of races that I've seen where they've taken a treadmill and they've put it at the pace of Eliud Kipchoge's sub-2, and people can get on it and try to last for as long as they can. And people will just get thrown off the back of this thing because it's a sprint pace for normal folks. But
yeah, when you think of running, how few people can, running a 4.5 minute mile is a big challenge. That might be that's a really good time for a high school track kid, to run a 4.5 minute mile. And this guy can do it for 26 miles. Yeah, and I've seen those videos, and if you Google Eliud Kipchoge test or something like that, you'll see these YouTube videos of people, they last, 15 seconds and boom, they're off the back of the treadmill.
And I think there's something to the point that Eliud Kipchoge could give very good sprinters a run for their money in a sprint race.
Yeah.
But sprinters could not give Eliud Kipchoge a run for his money in anything over a mile.
Yeah.
And so there's something to the limitations of adaptation in this domain that's worth people considering to know how high the ceiling is.
Yeah, I mean, he would obviously not be competitive at a world level in, short events, power events like a 200 or a 100 or even a 400. But once you get up into the 800 or mile distance, he would probably be reasonably competitive. I think his best mile time is, right at 4 minutes. So while he's not a miler, I mean, the good milers now are 350. So that's, he's still a ways off that. But it is one of the interesting things about running too is guys like him, they probably started as milers. So they've developed this base of speed when they were relatively young, so they could learn to run at a 4 minute mile pace. And then as their aerobic capacity increased over time, they could take that speed and move it to longer and longer distances. And that's why they for a while he ran 5Ks and then he moved up to the 10,000 and then finally the marathon. But you never see people moving the other way because they don't have the speed. You can't take somebody who, let's say, runs a 3-hour marathon and expect them to run a sub 30-minute 10 kilometer. It just won't happen because they don't have enough speed in their legs. They don't have enough power to do it. But yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, he would do better relative to Usain Bolt in a 100-meter sprint than Usain Bolt would do relative to him in a marathon.
I think there's a nugget there when we think of tactical athletes specifically, because there is this element of strength, whether it's for the PT test that you have to take or just the job itself. And we had a episode on this earlier about our tactical athletes, endurance or strength athletes more so. And I think the takeaway is that you can, with a lot less work than I think people realize, you can sort of hit that appropriate sport specific strength threshold, but there is so much room for improvement on the aerobic side that it's worth looking at your overall training plan and just kind of considering, am I doing so much work in the gym because it's where I'm comfortable and I'm avoiding the aerobic stuff because it's sort of new and different? Or have I kind of appropriately dosed this so that I'm accounting for the fact that, kind of to the Eliud Kipchoge, Usain Bolt analogy, I can be strong enough to do the job, but the aerobic component is really bottomless, and I get much more bang for my buck if I spend a lot more time there, I guess is what I'm getting at.
And honestly, it takes more time. You've got to go out for a 2-hour run, and you got to do a 2-hour run. And so it takes many of those to really build this base. But I think you're right that in my experience, and I have to say it's somewhat limited, but most of the guys that come to me that are training for these big time selections, they have such a good strength training background. They're more than adequate strength probably to do these, to get in, especially because the events of some of these tier 1 selections is the only time you ever do a pull-ups on day 1. That's it. It's over. Test is over. Done. Now you move on to all this stuff where you got to carry a pack and run around the woods for 8 or 10 hours a day. So they have adequate strength. And it turns out, as you said, Drew, once you have that level of strength, it doesn't take that much to maintain it. You do not need to do 3 gym sessions a week to keep that strength. These guys I work with typically have done 1 gym strength session a week is all. And they maintain it. And I've had a couple of them actually say, I've never been this strong. I had a guy training for one of these tier 1 selections last year who said, I have never been this strong in my life. And he was doing 1 gym strength workout. It was a max strength protocol. And he said, I've spent my whole military career, 4 or 5 days in the gym, and we're doing all this strength training. And he said, I'm stronger now than I've ever been. So I think that there is, as you guys know, strength training is very exhausting to the nervous system. This stuff we're talking about is more exhausting to the metabolism. And the metabolism recovers much faster than the nervous system. You think about, you can't go into the gym and do, deadlifts to failure 4 or 5 days a week. But it's not because of the muscles. It's because your central nervous system loses the drive to recruit those muscles. And so it's easy to overdo strength training, I think. And I believe that happens frequently.
I think a piece of it too, there's obviously a ton of talk about risk reduction, like injury risk reduction in the military. And it's easy to look at the numbers and see how many injuries come from running in the military. And that's why I want to circle back a little bit to some points made earlier about, especially in this culture, people don't want to go as slow as you guys are suggesting they need to go for the base building stuff. It's really uncomfortable to check the ego and actually back off that much. And then I think people need to be more conservative with the progression too. People want, I get questions all the time about like, what should I do to crush my PT test? It's in 10 days. Like, well, you needed to ask what to do a long time ago, because there's a strategy we can use for the 10-day. It's a whole different conversation to build the base, and you have to be much more conservative about how fast you progress and how much time you put into this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't know, running injuries are rampant, in the civilian population too. But I think especially in yours, because, there's the ego component and people don't want to be seen running slowly. I have a story in one of I think it was the first book I wrote about I trained this Olympic cross-country skier who, believe it or not, was aerobically deficient. And I had to have him slow down. And he's a pretty well-known guy in the ski community that he lived in. And I was having him he had to slow down to like an 8.5 minute mile to stay in his aerobic zone. And he told me, I have to have a paper bag over my head when I go out running, because people, they know him. He's kind of a famous guy where he lives. And here he's seen jogging along at what he would consider kind of a granny pace. And he said, it's just so embarrassing to have to do this. So I get it. I've seen it a lot. And I think that, but if you want to avoid injury, then you're going to have to check that ego for sure. It's probably your worst enemy in endurance sports is ego.
It's tough. During COVID, I used to do a lot of these in a national park or national forest that was real close to my apartment where I lived at the time. And I would go out with the best intentions of running like zone 2 the whole time. And I would be very, very good at it, other than the part where the boat dock was at the park, where all the people were. Mm-hmm. And inevitably, once people could see me, without thinking about it, I'd lose track of what the intent was, and I'd speed up a little bit too much, and I'd have to check myself once I got away from the people. And it would happen all the time.
I'm probably, I'm the biggest proselytizer for this kind of information. And I do the same thing. I'm out on a trail running and I see somebody, and I will without any intention, speed up. It happens. Yeah.
That's why Scott has to live in a house tucked away in the woods, very far away from civilization. If you try to find Scott's house, it's in the middle of nowhere, because if he runs near anybody, he breaks out his zone too.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
That's the tough part, though.
Yeah, exactly. So people have to understand, that the purpose of this training session is this, and your friends have to understand it. The guys you're training with, you go, hey, nope, that pace is too fast for me. I'm going to slow down and run at this other pace, and that's tough to do if you're in a culture. I mean, I discovered that I worked with the SEALs for, Drew can attest to this, very unsuccessfully for quite some time. That community was not interested in hearing this message. That there just was I got no buy-in. I mean, I did get buy-in from several athletes, and a couple of them went through the dev group selection and made it, so it works. But the general community at large, no, there's no way they were going to go out and run slow. So yeah, I understand there's a huge resistance in your community to this. I understand why, and I think this is something that another lesson we could learn from conventional endurance sports is it's very hard to understand why running slower is going to make you run faster in the long run, or skiing slower, or swimming slower, or riding your bike slower, whatever. Because people look at the event, the race, in this case, in these conventional endurance sports, they look at the race and they go, wait a minute, I'm not running at that slow pace. I'm running as fast as I can for as long as I can in this, whatever the race is. And then what they see is my limit in this race is right at what I would call their endurance limit. They're running at their endurance limit, and it's a 5K. They're running faster than if they're running a 10K, but they're running at their endurance limit. So they think, oh, my performance sucks at this endurance limit. I need to do more training at that endurance limit. And that's that mentality that's, I think, somewhat it's intuitive. That's the way you'd think, hey, if I'm bad at something, I need to do more of it. And that makes complete sense. But unfortunately, the physiology is pretty counterintuitive, that no, what's limiting you is not that endurance limit. You're being limited because you don't have enough aerobic capacity to run faster for longer. And so I think that's that kind of an overemphasis on specificity. And you can think of, and again, using more conventional or traditional athletes, if this held true, that we should all train at our race pace, at our endurance limit all the time, then Eliud Kipchoge would go run a marathon every day as hard as he could. I mean, he would want to do an event every day or as often as possible that looked just like the event he was training for. And yet he rarely trains at that 4.5 mile pace. Rarely. I mean, probably in the range of 5% of his training is done at that intensity. And I think the same holds true in your world, is that people look at the events they're training for, which may be a PT test, or they look at the job requirements of, dev group or the unit, and they go, wow, look at these guys, are big and strong and break down doors, and they have to be able to have all this strength and speed. And they don't understand that what's underlying that is still this aerobic base. And it has this counterintuitive rationale that I've struggled to try to explain to people, is that no, you actually need to slow down to go faster. And that what's difficult for people that come from a strength background is they go, wait a minute, if I wanted to get a better deadlift, I'm not going to go in the gym and lift lighter weights for more reps. I'm going to have to go in the gym and lift heavy weight for fewer reps. But again, strength training is you're training a different system than you're training when you're training for endurance. And so you have to kind of leave that whole strength training mindset behind you.
It's interesting because I don't remember who said it, but it was in the business or economic world. And the catchphrase was macro patience, micro speed. And this is almost the exact opposite of that when we think of the endurance building, where it's micro patience in terms of your daily sessions being methodical, being slow, for macro speed in the long term, where if you do the work over time, the speed or whatever the event is that you're training for sort of delivers itself because you've laid the foundation.
Yeah, consistency is so crucial. to, I think, any training, but especially endurance training. And that's because you need this stimulus fairly frequently. The aerobic metabolic pathway that we've been kind of referencing this whole time, the biggest stimulus to improvement for it is the volume of training. That's it. And it's not about intensity. It's about how many hours you spend a week running. That's what's going to cause this stimulus. It's analogous, like maybe that is analogous to, okay, how many tons did you lift this week? That would be another way to think of it. A similar sort of thing. The more tonnage you're lifting in a week, the more likely you're going to see strength gains. So, or the more volume you are running, the more likely you are to see gains in this aerobic area as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, to kind of, because we've gone on a journey now with the base building stuff. For people who want to learn more about this, specific to Uphill Athletes, specific to you and kind of your work, where's the best place for people to find you?
Well, the easiest way is to go to our website, which is uphillathlete.com. And I have to confess that we don't have a high profile, maybe intentionally or maybe by virtue of the fact that we don't have not enough people are interested in the tactical world and what we're doing. It's beginning to get bigger, especially after this Best Ranger competition results. But we're in the process of putting together a tactical section on the website to address these special needs, because we realize, or I certainly realize, that this is an underserved community that doesn't know much about this. It doesn't have very much access to this kind of information. And I'm really passionate about it, as you can probably tell. And I want to try to get this information out there in language that the tactical athletes and military athletes will understand. When you go to our website, it's going to be mostly concerning, climbing, alpinism, mountaineering, ski mountaineering, running in the mountains, that sort of thing. And again, the reason that this has been, if you can put aside the fact that, okay, well, I'm not a climber or I'm not a runner, again, the muscles don't know the difference between that and rucking. They can't tell. So if you can understand that, there's a ton of information on this website about the fundamental principles and then the physiology of all this stuff. And then this tactical section that we're building, in the process of building, will be more in, like I said, the language of the tactical athlete. And I hope we have that, complete in the next couple of months, so that there's some resource there that people can relate to. Then we'll at the same time be rolling out some training plans for folks to use for these various selections. And of course, there's always coaching that's available. And, Drew is one of our coaches, and we have some other military coaches. We have one former SEAL, and this guy, Vince Pikowski, that won the Best Rangers, coaching for us. So we have people that can speak your language, understand the demands of your job, if you would choose to go with coaching.
Awesome. Well, hey, thanks again for coming on. Thanks for talking through this. I appreciate it.
You guys are very welcome. And again, anything I can do in this sphere of the world you guys live in, I'm happy to help try to contribute with. As I said, I butted my head against the wall pretty hard out in Virginia Beach a few times, and so our reach has become more word of mouth. That's how people are finding us, is, athletes are successful in these various selection processes, and they say, oh, I used this book and I trained this way, it helped me. So that's kind of how we're growing this. We're not really, again, we don't have much presence in that world. And maybe that's a good thing. We're kind of low key about it.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, hey, everybody, run slow.
But thanks so much for inviting me to come on. It's a real honor to talk to you guys about this stuff.
Yeah.
No, thank you.